June 1943. The sun over Alabama burned like molten brass, and the train that carried the captured men of the Afrika Korps rattled north through fields of cotton and pine. They sat behind barred windows, uniforms still dusty with African sand, hearts armored with the certainty that America was a fractured, spoiled country, a place too mixed, too chaotic, too weak to stand united. We believed America was soft, one of them would later write. A nation of races and religions, bound only by confusion. Yet as the train slowed near a small town, that conviction began to crack. On the station platform, children waved paper flags. A billboard flashed past the window, Greek festival tonight. A few miles later, another appeared, Mexican Rodeo Tomorrow. The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. Corporal Alfred Schuster, once a schoolteacher from Munich, whispered to the man beside him, "In Germany, difference is a crime. Here, it is a celebration." His words, scribbled later into a diary at Opelika camp, would one day outlive every speech he had ever heard in uniform. The engine hissed and lurched. Through gaps in the rail cars, they saw faces. Italians, Irish, black, white, all working side by side to unload crates marked U.S. Army rations. To the Germans, it was disorienting. In North Africa, they had been taught that unity came from sameness, that order required purity. Yet here, in this land, they were told was divided. Everything seemed to move in concert. A great machine powered by its very diversity. Even the accents on the radio seemed to harmonize rather than clash. A young soldier named Karl Weiss pressed his forehead to the glass. He had studied engineering at Dresden before the war, and once believed the Reich's precision was unmatched. But now he watched a crew of black and white mechanics repairing the same rail line together, joking, sharing a bottle of Coca-Cola. Their rhythm was effortless, almost musical. For the first time, Karl felt an emotion he couldn't quite name, admiration tinged with envy. When the train crossed a bridge into Mississippi, the prisoners noticed banners fluttering from church steeples and storefronts. Each bore a different language, yet all carried the same message: victory through unity. It was not the forced unity of slogans and fear. It was the kind that hummed through the streets like electricity. For men raised under a regime that demanded absolute conformity, the discovery was almost unbearable. That night, as the railcars creaked in the humid darkness, Schuster opened his notebook and wrote one line that survived the war. "We thought America was weak because it was made of many kinds of people, but that is what makes it strong." The sentence, born in the rattle of a prisoner train, would become the first crack in a wall of belief built over years of propaganda. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. The camp at Hearne, Texas, looked at first like any other prison. Rows of wooden barracks, fences lined with barbed wire, guard towers standing silent under the hard sun. Yet what the prisoners discovered inside would challenge something deeper than captivity itself. Every morning, the Afrika Korps band was ordered to play marches. Erika, Panzerlied, the familiar anthems that once echoed through desert canyons. But one afternoon in late autumn 1944, their music was interrupted by another sound drifting from beyond the wire. Across the fields, near the cotton warehouse, a group of black American laborers began to sing. The melody was rough, rising from calloused throats, yet it carried with it a solemn dignity that made the prisoners stop playing. The words were unmistakable. "Oh, say, can you see?" The national anthem. The same flag that flew above their captors now waved in rhythm with a voice they had been taught to despise. Karl Friedrich Reiner, A German engineer assigned to maintenance duty stood frozen beside his trumpet. He had once believed in the racial hierarchies printed in Reich textbooks, yet here was a man who by Nazi standards would be considered inferior, singing of freedom with pride and belonging. The contrast pierced deeper than any interrogation could. That night, Reiner wrote in his diary, "When they sang Land of the Free, I understood freedom was not a slogan. It was a sound." Rumors spread through the camp that even the guards had paused to listen. The song became a small legend among the prisoners. Some mocked it, whispering that it was staged propaganda. Others fell silent, unable to explain why their throats felt tight. For years they had shouted "Heil" on command, but none had ever sung for love of a country that truly allowed them to belong. A week later, during Sunday recreation, a sergeant named Heinrich Yost asked an American sergeant, a black man from New Orleans, how he could sing for a nation that still segregated him. The man replied simply, "Because it's mine too." Jost didn't answer. He walked away with the unease of someone realizing that ownership of one's country was not assigned by race, but earned by faith. In the barracks that night, the prisoners argued. Some insisted it was hypocrisy. How could a nation claim freedom while dividing people by color? Others, like Reiner, sensed something more profound. "They fight over equality," he said quietly, "because they still believe they can reach it. We stopped believing long ago." When the lights went out, a faint echo of the anthem still drifted in Karl's mind. He imagined that voice in the dark, cracked, defiant, unashamed. And for the first time, he began to suspect that the war they were losing was not just military, but moral. By late summer 1944, a small group of Afrika Korps prisoners, including Karl Weiss and Heinz Vogel, were transferred from Herne to a labor detachment in rural Iowa. The train north was quieter this time. The men no longer muttered about escape or victory. They were curious. Through the window, endless rows of corn shimmered under the sun like gold, and the air smelled of soil, diesel, and distant rain. When they arrived, an American farmer named Samuel Carter greeted them with a nod. No salute, no sneer, just the casual efficiency of a man who saw work to be done. Each morning, the Germans loaded onto a truck and rode out to the fields with a mixed crew. Mexican pickers from El Paso, 2 elderly locals, and Carter himself. There were no speeches, no barking of orders, only the sound of the reaper engines and the rhythmic scrape of scythes. Karl, who had once repaired tanks for the Wehrmacht, found himself fixing the belt on an American harvester beside a teenager who offered him a sandwich. No guard intervened, no line separated prisoner from farmer. At noon, the whistle blew. Everyone gathered beneath a shade tree, and Carter's wife brought out a long wooden plank balanced on barrels. Their lunch table. She laid out sandwiches, coffee in tin mugs, slices of apple pie. The Germans hesitated at first. Heinz Vogel whispered, "Surely we must wait for the Americans to finish." But Carter simply gestured, "Sit down, food's getting cold." For the first time in his life, Heinz saw a landowner eat beside laborers. The Mexican workers told jokes in Spanish. The Americans laughed. Someone passed Karl a jar of pickles. Conversation rolled easily between them, about weather, baseball, the harvest. No one mentioned war. Heinz later wrote in his camp notebook, "In Germany, one man sits above the rest. In America, everyone sits at one table." That small act of equality struck harder than any lecture on democracy. In the Reich, the lines between master and worker were drawn in stone. Obedience was a religion. Here, the hierarchy dissolved over coffee and cornbread. Karl noticed how Carter asked his teenage helper's opinion on the machine's fuel line, then actually followed the suggestion. Authority here was not shouted, it listened. When the meal ended, the men stood and stretched, wiping sweat from their faces. The American farmer smiled and said, "Same time tomorrow, boys." It was the first time Karl had been called boy without humiliation. On the ride back to camp, the prisoners sat in reflective silence. They had witnessed a society that argued, joked, and worked as equals. And somehow, it functioned better than the rigid order they had worshipped. That night, Heinz couldn't sleep. He stared at the rafters of the barrack and whispered, "If a nation can sit together at one table, perhaps it can never truly be conquered." Outside, crickets chirped and a warm breeze carried the smell of harvest through the wire. By November 1944, the war had turned decisively against Germany. The prisoners in Camp Crossville, Tennessee, heard whispers of Allied advances in bombed cities back home. Yet behind the fences of this quiet American camp, they found something no rumor had prepared them for: freedom of thought, even in a time of total war. Karl Weiss had been assigned to assist in the camp library, a modest wooden building stocked with English novels, technical manuals, and stacks of American magazines donated by nearby townspeople. He found comfort in the smell of paper and glue, in the ritual of sorting issues of Life and the Saturday Evening Post. One afternoon, he opened the magazine to a full-page illustration: President Franklin D. Roosevelt, drawn with exaggerated teeth and a comically long cigarette holder, laughing as his hat blew away in the wind. The caption read, "Even the president can't control the weather." For a long moment, Karl simply stared. In Germany, such a drawing would have meant prison, or worse. There, power demanded reverence. Here, it endured ridicule. When another prisoner, Lieutenant Otto Hermann, saw the image, he muttered, "In Berlin, the artist would already be gone." Yet the American librarian smiled and said, "We laugh at everyone here, even the boss." That afternoon became an invisible milestone in the minds of many. To laugh at authority without fear, it was a concept more alien than the English language itself. Karl remembered how, in his student days, professors had warned them never to question the Reich's leaders. Here, even during war, the people mocked their president and went home unpunished. It wasn't chaos, it was confidence. The next week, a sergeant handed out the New York Times. Its front page carried grim headlines from France and the Pacific, but also an opinion column criticizing the government's rationing policies. The idea that a newspaper could openly challenge its own leaders stunned the prisoners. "They fight among themselves," Otto said, half mocking, half in awe, "and yet the system does not break." Karl began to sense that the true strength of this country was not in its tanks or its aircraft, but in its ability to contain disagreement without fear. Unity, he realized, did not mean uniformity. It meant the capacity to hold difference without breaking apart. Late one night, he wrote in his notebook, "Power here is not sacred. It breathes because it is questioned." That sentence would later be found by American archivists among the declassified camp documents. In the stillness of the barrack, Karl listened to the crickets outside, then to the faint laughter from the guard tower. Somewhere, a radio played jazz. The music once banned as degenerate back home. He smiled quietly, understanding at last that laughter, not obedience, was the sound of freedom. Winter, 1945. The Texas wind carried dust across the yard of a small maintenance depot attached to Camp Hearn. There, German prisoners repaired fences and painted equipment for the local county. Among them was Karl Weiss, his hands now calloused from labor, yet his mind restless with questions. America had contradicted everything he had been taught, but one doubt still lingered. Perhaps it was all surface, a performance built on machines and wealth. One afternoon, as the men worked near a storage shed, a pickup truck arrived. An older American stepped out, his left sleeve pinned where an arm had once been. He was a veteran of the North African campaign, a mechanic before the war, now overseeing civilian repairs. The guards called him Mr. Lewis. When he saw the German POWs, he nodded politely. Karl, unable to restrain his curiosity, asked through the interpreter, "Sir, why do you work here? You fought against us." Lewis wiped his brow. "Because the war's done for me. The world still needs fixing." His tone was matter of fact, not bitter. During a lunch break, a small crowd gathered around as Lewis sat on a crate, eating from a lunch pail painted with a fading American flag. Heinz Vogel, sitting nearby, murmured something in German, a remark about how America's strength came only from its machines, not its people. Lewis looked up. "No," he said evenly, "machines make the guns. Men decide when to pull the trigger." The words cut through the air. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the guards pretended not to listen. Karl stared at the stump of Lewis's arm, the silent proof of a decision once made and paid for. The conversation that followed became almost a seminar on morality, disguised as a workshop argument. Karl pressed on. "But your nation allows disagreement, even weakness. In Germany, that would be dangerous." Lewis smiled faintly. "Maybe. But we argue because we care. That's how you keep something alive." That night, back in the barracks, the debate continued among the prisoners. Some dismissed the veterans' words as American arrogance. Others, including Karl, sensed the truth beneath them. That strength was not the absence of division, but the decision to keep talking through it. The U.S. War Department's morale study, 1945, later recorded that this exchange had been overheard by a camp translator and logged as evidence of ideological erosion through dialogue, not propaganda. The report's clinical phrasing could never capture the tremor it left in Karl's conscience. He lay awake long after lights out, hearing the echo of that single sentence. Machines make the guns. Men decide when to pull the trigger. For the first time, he wondered how many times he himself had fired without deciding, just obeying. To you watching now, do you think conviction is stronger when chosen freely or when commanded? Write your thoughts below. History often turns on how we answer that question. Spring 1945 arrived with the scent of wet earth and magnolia drifting through the fences of Camp Shelby, Mississippi. By then, the war in Europe was collapsing, but the prisoners knew little. Their days blurred into labor shifts near the base, repairing wooden crates and clearing debris along the training grounds. Then, one humid afternoon, a column of soldiers passed through the road nearby, the sound of muffled drums marking a funeral procession. The POWs stopped working. At the front of the column walked black and white servicemen together, their uniforms dark with sweat, their faces solemn. 2 coffins followed, draped in the same American flag. A chaplain's voice carried on the wind, one coffin for a white lieutenant, the other for a black private named Samuel Carter, killed in a training explosion. The prisoners gathered silently by the fence as the procession reached the field cemetery. For men raised in a world where difference dictated worth, the sight was incomprehensible. In Germany, such a burial would have been unthinkable. Here, beneath one sky, both soldiers rested under the same banner. The prisoners watched as the rifles fired the salute, 3 sharp cracks that seemed to echo through their own certainties. Karl Weiss felt his throat tighten. A guard, a young sergeant from Ohio, noticed his expression and said softly, "He was a good man. The color of his skin doesn't change that." The sentence lingered long after the rifles fell silent. Later that evening, the POWs returned to camp unusually quiet. In the barracks, arguments broke out again. Not about politics this time, but about what they had just seen. One man insisted it was hypocrisy, that America pretended unity for show. Another, older soldier muttered, "If it were only for show, they would not share the same grave. Karl took out a small notebook and wrote, "In Germany, the color of a man's skin decides his worth. Here, a flag covers both. Perhaps unity is not perfection. Perhaps it is the courage to stand together despite imperfection." When the camp lights dimmed, the memory of the ceremony lingered like a quiet flame. Karl thought of the song he had heard months earlier, the Star-Spangled Banner sung by black workers, and realized the words "Land of the Free" now carried faces, names, and sacrifice. The next morning, as the prisoners lined up for roll call, they noticed an American soldier planting a small wooden cross at the base fence facing the cemetery. No words, no orders, just a gesture of respect from one human to another. To those watching now, what do you think unity truly means? Is it the absence of division or the will to bridge it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. This question has no single answer, but every reflection brings us closer to understanding it. September 1946. The war had ended a year before, and the long trains of repatriation were finally rolling east, carrying thousands of German prisoners toward the ports of New York and New Orleans. Karl Weiss sat among them, a canvas duffel at his feet, his mind drifting between relief and unease. They were free, yet changed. In his pocket, he carried a small token, a folded American lunch pail label, and a miniature U.S. flag from the Red Cross farewell package. As the ship Marine Tiger prepared to depart for Bremen, the docks were crowded with volunteers handing out supplies, chocolate bars, soap, pocket Bibles, and small flags stitched from thin cotton. Most prisoners tucked them away indifferently, but Karl turned his over in his hands, tracing the stars and stripes as if studying a code. Nearby, an older man with pale blue eyes, Hans Dirks, a former Afrika Korps driver, smiled and said, "Keep it. It's lighter than guilt." The ship's engines rumbled to life. America faded into mist, yet no one cheered. They watched the shoreline shrink, the cranes and warehouses dissolving into a line of gray on the horizon. For months, they had lived inside a paradox. Captives treated more humanely than they had treated their own enemies. The lessons were quiet but permanent, engraved in details. The mixed crews unloading trains in Alabama, the laughter at the Iowa lunch table, the cartoon of Roosevelt, the one-armed veteran's steady gaze, and the shared flag over two soldiers' graves. When night fell, the deck filled with the murmurs of men remembering. Someone began humming an American tune, soft, hesitant, but sincere. It was not mockery, it was memory. Karl opened his notebook and wrote the final line of his wartime diary. "I came to fight the enemies of unity and found none here. Only people trying, failing, and trying again together." As the Atlantic wind swept the deck, Hans Dirks stood alone near the railing. He tied the tiny flag to a splintered piece of rope, letting it flutter against the night sky. The gesture was wordless, but everyone nearby understood. A few stepped forward and saluted, not as Germans or Americans, but as men who had seen what strength looked like when it wore no uniform. Years later, in 1980, an American journalist visiting Bremen would find that same flag framed on Hans's wall, colors faded but edges intact. When asked why he kept it, Hans answered simply, "Because it reminded me that the world is not as divided as they told us." The sea kept its rhythm beneath them that night, waves like slow heartbeats carrying men home to a broken continent, each holding a fragment of a nation they once misunderstood. The only sound on deck was the faint rustle of cloth in the wind, a symbol not of victory, but of understanding hard won. Years later, historians would study the quiet transformation of those Afrika Korps prisoners and call it re-education through observation. But for the men who lived it, it had nothing to do with lectures or propaganda leaflets. It happened through the slow accumulation of moments so ordinary they seemed invisible. A shared meal under a tree, a newspaper that mocked its own president, a song sung by a man who had every reason not to sing. Those fragments, stitched together, formed the picture of a nation that drew its power not from uniformity, but from friction, discussion, and coexistence. Karl Weiss returned to a ruined Dresden, rebuilt his workshop, and tried to teach his apprentices what he had learned. That strength is not born of silence. In the evenings, when the lights went out across the city, he would take from his shelf the small notebook that had followed him through captivity. On its last page was the line he had written on the ship. "I came to fight the enemies of unity, and found none here." He never read it aloud, but it guided him quietly, like a compass that always pointed toward decency. Across Germany, thousands of former prisoners carried similar memories. Some spoke of a field in Iowa where everyone sat at one table. Others remembered a Christmas service where an old woman had given them candles. None claimed America was perfect, yet all agreed that it was whole in a way they had never imagined. Flawed, loud, divided on the surface, but bound by the stubborn belief that people could still belong together despite their differences. Time erases borders faster than memories. When veterans on both sides met decades later, they discovered they no longer argued about victory or defeat. They talked about the sound of factory whistles, the taste of cornbread, the music that floated across the wire. In those simple recollections, the grand ideologies of the 20th century seemed small again, dwarfed by the persistence of human connection. And somewhere in a modest apartment in Bremen, that tiny cotton flag still trembled in the draft of an open window. Its colors pale, but its meaning intact. It was never a trophy. It was proof that even in war, understanding can cross a fence, a field, an ocean. That sometimes the mightiest transformation begins not with surrender, but with the courage to listen.